To look into the mirror of the self is to gaze into a library where the books are written in a language of salt, sugar, and light. We are accustomed to thinking of our biology as an absolute ledger, an unvarnished chronicle of every step our ancestors took across the frost-rimed steppes and through the sun-baked savannas of antiquity. We are told by the high priests of modern genomics that within the tightly coiled ladders of our deoxyribonucleic acid, the entire human odyssey is preserved, etched into the chemical bedrock of our existence. This molecule, we believe, is an archival masterpiece, a biological tapestry where not a single thread has been dropped, a vast and continuous scroll tracing our lineage back to the primordial spark of conscious life. Yet, when we press our ears close to the humming machinery of the genome, we begin to catch the faint, unsettling frequency of a profound silence. We discover that this grand archive is not a continuous cinematic reel, but a heavily edited manuscript, punctuated by sudden, yawning chasms where memory has been systematically dissolved. The most provocative of these silences manifests as a phantom epoch, a blank parchment spanning roughly 4 centuries that appears to have been entirely excised from the biological ledger of modern humanity. Imagine an antiquarian discovering a monumental volume of world history, bound in heavy leather and illuminated with gold leaf, only to find that exactly 400 pages in the absolute center of the text have been cleanly cut from the binding with a razor. The narrative skips from a vibrant, complex reality on one side of the ledger directly to a transformed landscape on the other, leaving no transitional footprints, no grammatical bridges, and no explanatory notes. This is the anatomical reality of the missing 400 years, a temporal blind spot hidden inside the very nucleus of our cells. It is a biological amnesia that challenges our fundamental understanding of heritage, identity, and the mechanisms of time itself. When we consider what it means for 400 years of human history to be left out of our DNA code, we are forced to move beyond the cold metrics of population genetics and step into a more expansive, almost cosmic theater of contemplation. This missing epoch is not merely a technical quirk or a glitch in our current sequencing technologies. It represents a fundamental law of the biological universe, a deliberate architecture of forgetting. We must ask ourselves what transpired during that occluded window of time, a period long enough to see empires rise and crumble into dust, long enough for languages to be born and forgotten, and long enough for an entirely different way of being human to take root on this planet. If our DNA is a mirror of our past, then this missing segment suggests that we are looking at a fractured glass, one that reflects a carefully curated silhouette rather than the full, messy, glorious complexity of our ancestral truth. To understand this phenomenon, we must first divest ourselves of the illusion that biology is a passive recording device. We often imagine that our genetic code acts like a camera with an open shutter, continuously capturing every trauma, every triumph, every migration, and every environmental whisper, translating them faithfully into codons and base pairs. In reality, the genome is a fiercely selective editor operating on a principle of radical economy. It behaves less like an inclusive historian and more like a desperate sailor throwing heavy cargo overboard during a storm to keep the ship afloat. The biological memory of our species is subject to an intense, invisible filtration process, an evolutionary triage that decides which experiences are worthy of being carried across the threshold of generations, and which must be cast into the abyss of oblivion. The missing 400 years represent the ultimate manifestation of this triage, an entire era deemed too heavy, too volatile, or perhaps too dangerously transformative to be integrated into the permanent architecture of the human blueprint. This realization introduces a haunting duality into our sense of self. We live our lives under the assumption that our bodies are the ultimate truth, that our bloodlines carry an unbroken transmission of who we are. We build identities on the results of genetic heritage tests, celebrating the percentages of geographical ancestry printed on glossy charts. But what if the most defining chapter of our collective journey is precisely the one that cannot be sequenced? What if the key to our current existential restlessness, our deep-seated intuition that we are missing some vital piece of our own map, lies in that silent, unmappable 400-year void? This is the cosmic dimension of the mystery, a reminder that we are shaped not only by what has been remembered, but also by what has been aggressively forgotten. We are built around an empty center, a hollow sanctuary within our own cells, where a vital portion of our history used to breathe. As we stand on the precipice of this realization, the landscape of human history begins to shift shape. Events that we thought we understood through the dry medium of textbooks and archaeological ruins suddenly take on a spectral, biological urgency. We begin to see that the true theater of human evolution is not the external world of monuments and battlefields, but the internal, microscopic wilderness of the cell. The 400 years left out of our DNA code represent a secret counter-narrative, a subterranean river of human experience that flowed beneath the surface of the official biological record. It is a period where the human spirit may have undergone a crucible so intense, or an awakening so radical, that it could not be contained within the chemical vocabulary of our species. The body, in its infinite, conservative wisdom, chose to close its eyes to that era, leaving us to navigate the modern world with an incomplete compass. To explore this missing epoch is to engage in a form of biological archaeology, an attempt to reconstruct a temple from the negative space it left behind in the dirt. We cannot use the standard tools of the laboratory to map this territory. Instead, we must look for the ripples, the anomalies, and the sudden, unexplained shifts in human consciousness that occurred when the biological narrative resumed. We must learn to read the silence itself, treating the genetic void not as a dead end, but as a profound monument to an experience that defied preservation. It is an invitation to consider that our true inheritance is not merely the physical code passed down through the loins of our ancestors, but the vast, unwritten potential that slumbers in the gaps between the lines. Ultimately, this exploration is an act of reclamation. By acknowledging the missing 400 years, we refuse to be defined solely by the material constraints of our biology. We recognize that humanity is an open-ended story, a consciousness that overflows the narrow vessels of its own DNA. We begin to understand that the absence of this historical chapter in our code is not a deficit, but a profound space of freedom. It is a blank page in the very heart of our design, a place where we are permitted to break free from the deterministic chains of the past and write an entirely new destiny. The silence in our cells is not a tomb. It is an open door, whispering of a forgotten freedom that we are now called to remember. To venture into the silent heart of this genetic void is to encounter the hidden laws that govern the transmission of human consciousness across time. The first core concept we must grapple with is the illusion of biological continuity itself. We are conditioned by the visible world to believe that time moves in an unbroken, linear thread, and that our physical bodies reflect this smooth progression. We view our lineage as an uninterrupted chain of lamps, each lighting the next across the dark expanse of centuries. However, the architecture of the missing 400 years reveals that biological time is actually non-linear and highly selective. It operates through sudden compressions, radical expansions, and most crucially, systematic erasures. The genome does not record history, it digests it. And like any digestive process, it retains only the base nutrients required for survival while discarding the complex, volatile, or heavy structures of the lived experience. This selective distillation introduces the concept of the evolutionary threshold, an invisible boundary line where historical events are either translated into genetic permanence or permanently dissolved into the ether. During the missing 400 years, humanity appears to have passed through an intense existential pressure cooker, a period of such concentrated transformation that the standard mechanisms of genetic recording were overwhelmed. Think of a recording device exposed to a sound so deafening, or a light so blinding, that its circuits temporarily freeze, leaving a stretch of static on the tape. The events of this occluded epoch did not fail to leave a mark because they were insignificant. Rather, they were too monumental for the fragile medium of the chemical code to hold. The body, prioritizing immediate adaptation and structural survival, enacted a radical biological triage, sealing off this explosive chapter of our history to protect the stability of the generations to come. This leads us to a second profound theme: the distinction between biological memory and somatic resonance. While the technical readouts of our sequenced DNA show a complete blank for this 400-year period, the memory is not entirely gone. It has merely changed its state of matter. It has migrated from the hard drive of the genetic code into the cloud of our somatic and cultural intuition. We see the phantom limbs of this missing history in our collective anxieties, our unexplained artistic impulses, and the sudden, synchronized shifts in human consciousness that seem to erupt out of nowhere across the globe. It is a form of ancestral haunting, where the experiences of those forgotten generations continue to exert a powerful gravitational pull on our modern behavior, operating through the subterranean channels of the subconscious mind. We do not inherit their specific stories in our blood, but we inherit the emotional architecture, the psychological defense mechanisms, and the spiritual yearnings that those stories forged. Behind this phenomenon lies a universal pattern that can be observed throughout the natural world, the law of the protective scar. When a tree suffers a trauma, it does not leave the wound exposed to the elements. It grows a thick, featureless layer of bark over the area, sealing the damage away from the external world and preserving the integrity of the trunk. The missing 400 years in our DNA code functions exactly like this biological scar. It is a zone of dense, protective forgetting, a smooth surface engineered by our evolutionary biology to cover a period of profound rupture or hyper-evolution by erasing the specific agonizing details of that crucible. The human organism ensured that future generations could step into the world unburdened by the crippling weight of a specific, overwhelming past. It allowed us to start fresh, providing a blank slate upon which the post-crucible human could build a new reality. This realization forces us to confront the deep tension between deterministic biology and human sovereignty. If our genetic code were an absolute, unedited record of every ancestral trauma and triumph, we would be nothing more than biological automatons, completely enslaved to the momentum of our past. We would be drowning in the memories of 1,000 wars, 1,000 plagues, and 1,000 obsolete worldviews. The presence of the 400-year gap represents a beautiful flaw in the deterministic machine. It is a declaration of independence written into our very cells, a proof that we are not merely the sum total of our historical inputs. By leaving a massive chunk of our journey unwritten, nature granted us a zone of absolute freedom, an evolutionary clearing where the chains of cause and effect are broken, and where human consciousness is given the space to reinvent itself without permission from its ancestors. Furthermore, this core concept invites us to re-examine the true nature of human heritage. We live in an era obsessed with material tracing, where we look to saliva kits and digital databases to tell us who we are. But the missing epoch suggests that our truest identity is found not in what has been written down in the chemical ink of DNA, but in the vast, unmapped potential that resides within the silences of the code. The gap is not an empty vacuum. It is a pressurized womb of possibility. It is the place where the unwritten laws of human potential sleep, waiting for a consciousness brave enough to look past the material mirror and claim the invisible inheritance. We are defined by our absences just as much as our presences, and the 400 missing years serve as a cosmic reminder that the ultimate truth of who we are is something that can never be fully captured by a microscope or confined to a laboratory slide. To truly comprehend the nature of this 400-year silence, we must set aside the analytical scalpels of modern science and enter the realm of myth, allegory, and symbolic storytelling. Let us envision the human genome not as a clinical sequence of chemical bases, but as a magnificent, ancient cathedral standing at the edge of a timeless ocean. This cathedral has been constructed over hundreds of thousands of years, its stones carved by the hands of countless generations, its stained glass windows tinted with the blood, sweat, and tears of our migratory ancestors. Every archway tells a story of survival. Every vaulted ceiling echoes with the songs of triumphs over ice ages, famines, and catastrophic fires. Visitors walk through this cathedral in awe, believing they are witnessing a complete monument to the human spirit, a flawless architectural diary of where we have been and what we have conquered. Yet, if one walks deep into the transept of this biological cathedral, past the towering monuments of the Neolithic Revolution and the great migrations out of Africa, one encounters a heavy, seamless obsidian door. It has no keyhole, no handle, and no inscriptions. It breaks the continuous flow of the cathedral's architecture with an abrupt, imposing austerity. This door represents the missing 400 years. Behind it lies an entire wing of the cathedral that has been completely walled off from public view. There are no tapestries from this era hanging on the walls, no statues erected to its heroes, and no liturgies sung for its dead. The architects of our species have intentionally bricked up this vast gallery, sealing its treasures and its terrors in total darkness. The cathedral continues on the other side of this obsidian barrier, but the style of the masonry has radically shifted. The glass is cut differently, and the air carries a completely altered frequency. Let us explore another allegory, one born of the cosmic forge. Imagine a celestial cartographer tasked with mapping a great, burning constellation that has guided voyagers across the dark for millennia. For centuries, the cartographer charts the stars with absolute precision, noting how each burning point of light connects to the next in a perfect, geometric lattice of destiny. But suddenly, the cartographer discovers a massive, circular void right in the breast of the celestial creature, a profound pocket of absolute blackness where no star shines, no light escapes, and no cosmic dust lingers. For 400 light years, the stellar tapestry simply ceases to exist. Yet the stars on either side of this abyss behave as though they are bound by a powerful, invisible gravitational center. This is the black hole in the constellation of human heritage. The stars that should have filled that void did not die. Rather, they collapsed inward under the immense weight of an unrecorded human crucible, forming a singular point of infinite density within our subconscious reality. To understand what transpired within that unmapped dark, we might listen to the story of the alchemist's crucible. In the ancient traditions, the alchemist does not seek to preserve the form of the lead he places into the fire. His entire objective is the absolute destruction of its original identity. He stokes the furnace to a terrifying, white-hot intensity, a heat so violent that the metal loses its shape, its weight, its properties, and its very memory of having ever been lead. During this period of liquid chaos, the metal enters a state called the nigredo, the blackness, the void of absolute non-identity where the past is completely dissolved. If you were to peer into the crucible during those critical moments, you would see nothing but a faceless, swirling shadow. The missing 400 years was humanity's collective nigredo, It was a period where the human element was melted down so completely that its previous genetic history was wiped clean from the slate, allowing it to emerge from the furnace as a completely different energetic alloy, free from the tarnish of its old evolutionary habits. Consider, too, the myth of the great weaver who sits at the loom of time, spinning the thread of human destiny. The weaver works tirelessly, blending threads of gold, crimson, and iron into a fabric that represents the lived experience of our species. But at a certain point in the pattern, the weaver stops using colored thread entirely. For a span of 400 passes of the shuttle, the weaver spins with a thread made of pure, transparent glass, an invisible filament that holds the structure of the cloth together, but possesses no color, no weight, and no visible presence to the naked eye. To an untrained observer, looking at the finished tapestry, it appears as though there is a massive gaping hole in the center of the garment, a place where the fabric simply vanishes into thin air. Yet, when you touch that empty space, you find that it is remarkably strong, denser, and more resilient than any other part of the shroud. The missing history is that glass thread. It is the invisible infrastructure that supports the visible weight of our modern world, providing the hidden strength that prevents our entire biological narrative from unraveling. These symbols teach us that absence is not synonymous with vacancy. The blank pages in our genetic journal are filled with a potent, compressed energy that shapes our lives precisely because it remains unwritten. Like the negative space that defines the silhouette of a magnificent sculpture, or the silent pauses between notes that give a symphony its heart-wrenching beauty. The missing 400 years are the artistic defining point of the human story. They remind us that our biology is not just a collection of physical assets passed down from hand to hand, but a sacred container designed to hold a mystery that transcends the physical universe entirely. By embracing these symbolic narratives, we begin to see the genetic void not as a historical tragedy or a biological failure, but as a deliberate, masterful stroke of cosmic architecture, an intentional sanctuary where the human soul was permitted to recreate itself in secret, far away from the demanding eyes of history. When we descend from the heights of cosmic metaphor and bring our attention back to the immediate, tangible world, we must confront how a missing 400-year biological history impacts our daily existence. This genetic silence is not a dry academic puzzle. It is a living reality that actively shapes our psychology, our physical health, and our cultural behaviors. Because our DNA carries a structural scar where this epoch should be, modern humans are born with a unique form of existential phantom limb syndrome. We possess deep, instinctual drives, unnameable yearnings, and systemic anxieties that have no apparent source in our recorded, personal, or genetic past. By learning to recognize this missing history, we can begin to practically integrate its silence, transforming it from a source of unconscious restlessness into a tool for radical self-sovereignty. The first real-world implication manifests in our psychological well-being, specifically in the way we experience collective trauma and unexplained anxieties. Many individuals navigate their lives carrying a heavy weight of dread or hypervigilance that defies clinical explanation. They have not experienced severe personal trauma, nor can they trace these patterns to the lived histories of their immediate parents or grandparents. Traditional therapies often struggle to resolve these deep-seated emotional states because they look for causes within the visible lines of the psychological ledger. When we realize that our biology contains an immense, unwritten crucible, we understand that these feelings are often the somatic resonance of that missing 400-year void. It is the echo of a forgotten collective integration process humming in our nervous systems. Recognizing this allows us to stop pathologizing our deep anxieties. We can view them instead as ancient ancestral architecture, a protective energetic shield that we no longer need to carry in the modern world. This understanding carries revolutionary implications for physical health and epigenetic healing. Epigenetics, the science of how behaviors and environment alter how our genes work, teaches us that while our underlying DNA sequence is fixed, the expression of those genes is incredibly fluid. The missing 400-year gap represents a pristine sanctuary within our biological blueprint that remains completely unpolluted by the specific historical traumas, dietary stresses, and environmental diseases of that chaotic epoch. It is a biological reserve of pure human potential. When we engage in deep somatic practices, breath work, or intentional lifestyle shifts, we are effectively bypassing the cluttered, trauma-heavy chapters of our recent genetic history and tapping directly into this unwritten reservoir. We can consciously choose to draw our vitality from the pristine silence of the missing epoch rather than the chaotic, reactionary loops of our recorded ancestral lineages. Furthermore, this concept offers a powerful new framework for cultural and social liberation. Human societies are deeply tribal, often anchoring their identities, conflicts, and grievances in centuries-old historical narratives passed down through generations. We build walls around ourselves based on the recorded migratory paths and ancient battles etched into our cultural and genetic heritages. However, the presence of the missing 400 years provides us with a profound equalizer. It reminds us that at the center of every single human being, regardless of their modern ethnicity or geographic origin, lies the exact same biological void. We all share this identical patch of unmapped territory, this same silent cosmic crucible. In this light, the missing history becomes a universal bridge of shared humanity. It strips away the deterministic illusions of racial or cultural exceptionalism, showing us that our most defining evolutionary chapter is one where we were all reduced to the same faceless, liquid potential before emerging into the modern era. On an individual level, integrating this concept requires a radical shift in how we construct our personal identities. We live in a data-driven world that urges us to define ourselves by our inputs, our metrics, our lineages, and our past behaviors. We look at genetic ancestry tests to tell us who we are, effectively letting the material past dictate our future boundaries. But the missing 400 years proves that nature itself does not allow the past to have the final word. By intentionally erasing a massive chapter of our collective journey, our biology left us a permanent zone of autonomy. The practical takeaway is clear. You are not merely the sum total of what your ancestors survived. You are the author of the unwritten space. Whenever you encounter a moment of profound transition or personal crisis, you can step into the negative space of your own design, utilizing the silence in your cells to reinvent your life, completely free from the weight of prior programming. Ultimately, the real-world integration of this mystery leads to a life lived. From a state of profound active presence rather than passive reaction. When we stop trying to fill the 400-year gap with artificial narratives, historical speculation, or material attachments, we begin to find immense comfort in the stillness itself. We realize that the silence in our DNA is not a vacuum waiting to be stuffed with external validation, but a quiet, powerful sanctuary where the human spirit rests. By anchoring our awareness in this biological clearing, we gain the clarity needed to break free from the addictive, cyclical loops of societal conditioning. We learn to move through the world with the grace of a pioneer, knowing that our foundation is built not upon the shaky, shifting sands of recorded history, but upon the solid, immutable bedrock of an unwritten cosmic potential. To stand at the terminus of this long, introspective journey into the human architecture is to realize that the silent void inside our cells is not an omission, but a profound commission. We have traveled through the grand, edited archives of our biology, peered through the heavy obsidian doors of our evolutionary cathedral, and felt the phantom hum of an unmapped epoch vibrating within our modern nervous systems. We have seen how the selective alchemy of nature chose to dissolve 400 years of human history, leaving a pristine, unwritten sanctuary in the very center of our genetic scroll. This omission is the ultimate masterpiece of our evolutionary design, a masterful stroke of cosmic editing that saved humanity from being crushed beneath the deterministic weight of its own chaotic past. It is the place where the momentum of history stops and the absolute freedom of the present moment begins. We must now confront the transformational reality that this biological amnesia presents to our daily lives. For too long, we have lived as prisoners of ancestry, defining our capabilities, our psychological boundaries, and our ultimate destinies by the fragments of code passed down through the bloodlines of those who came before us. We have allowed the external world to convince us that we are nothing more than biological automatons, bound to repeat the traumas, the anxieties, and the structural limitations of an ancient lineage. But the missing 400 years stands as a monument to human sovereignty, a silent declaration written in chemical stone that you are not merely the sum total of your historical inputs. Nature has deliberately broken the chain of cause and effect inside your very nucleus, granting you a zone of absolute autonomy where the ghosts of the past hold no sway, and where the rules of ancestral limitation are completely dissolved. This realization is an urgent transformational call to awaken from the slumber of material determinism. It demands that you stop looking backward into the mirrors of genetic heritage to find out who you are, and instead look inward into the vast, pressurized womb of potential that slumbers in the gaps between your lines of code. The silence in your cells is an empty canvas, a sacred reservation of pure, unpolluted human energy that has been kept safe from the fires of history just for you. It is an invitation to step out of the reactionary loops of societal conditioning and become the conscious author of your own evolution. You are being called to claim this invisible inheritance, to step into the negative space of your design, and to write a completely new chapter of human consciousness with the ink of your own choices, your own triumphs, and your own unmapped potential. As we close this exploration, let the silence of the missing 400 years become your ultimate sanctuary and your greatest strength. Do not fear the empty spaces within your history or the unnameable yearnings within your soul. See them instead as the open doorways to a forgotten freedom. You are the bridge between an unwritten past and a limitless future, a magnificent expression of a consciousness that overflows the narrow vessels of its own biology. Carry this understanding into the world not as an intellectual theory, but as a living, breathing reality inside your chest. Walk with the radical grace of a being who knows they are anchored in the timeless, unmapped bedrock of the cosmos. Forever free to reinvent themselves, forever whole, and forever unchained from the history that tried to write them down.